Some questions now. Please raise your hands, wait for a microphone to be brought to you, introduce yourself and any affiliation you're willing to admit to. Right here.
Tim Carney, Washington Examiner. My question, I would like you to address what he was saying, what was that Kagan Crystal quote about both the foreign policy as well as the domestic policy being used to try to make Americans be better, the soul craft, statecraft as soul craft, I guess would be. Is that something you think is very present in the neocon thought?
Do you want to collect?
You can say.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tim. No, I don't think that's an especially large element of neoconservatism. Statecraft is soulcraft, by the way, is George Will's book title. So that is a kind of older, more paternalistic form of conservatism. Certainly not a libertarian form. But yes, it is true that David Brooks wrote an article about national greatness and his aspirations for national greatness, and that Bill Kristol associated himself with some elements of that. But this was an article, and a couple of columns with a proposal that essentially went nowhere. There did not emerge a kind of national greatness rallying cry amongst the neoconservatives, apart from a couple of them, and then again, let alone anything like a mass phenomenon. Now, I mean, at the time, my response to national greatness was I thought we were, pretty busy, being great in our own little way, as things were. I mean, this was kind of this was a period in which we were kind of coping with trying to be the unipolar power in the world, So I thought we had plenty to do in that respect. Some people thought we should, in addition, go to Mars. And okay, I mean, if you want a project to go to Mars, but I don't think that there's a I don't think that there's a great sort of sociological thick description that you need in order to get at this. I mean, is Brooks a conventional conservative? Well, no. I mean, have you read his New York Times columns lately? As to whether he is, he is an archetypal figure of neoconservatism, I would dispute that as well.
David, can I
Sure,
just say something very quickly on this? And that is, for the neoconservatives, the great threat to the United States has never been either communism nor Islamic totalitarianism. The great threat to the United States is nihilism. It's philosophic nihilism. This is absolutely clear in the writings of Strauss, and it's clear in the writings of Irving Kristol. And that fear of nihilism, which, by the way, they take the source, the root of modern cultural, philosophic, moral nihilism, right, is not Heidegger, it's not Nietzsche, it's Lockean liberalism. This is the great stalking horse of Strauss and the neocons. So you go straight from the Declaration of Independence to Boy George. Right? This is their view of the history of the nihilistic idea, which Strauss finds directly in John Locke. And so it's combating nihilism, which is the great task for the deepest thinking Straussians, and this notion of benevolent hegemony and war is one important way in which you fight nihilism, which is as I said, the great threat to the West.
Yes.
Hi, Mary Carrick. There was something, I have one comment, some questions. William Kristol in the Foreign Policy Initiative yesterday issued a statement not only calling for us to do the airspace thing, but also limited strikes in Libya. So there's a lot of saber rattling there. I had one question is if, for the neocon side, is if you believe in getting involved in all these rebellions, yet on the other hand, you like the government so much. Why is it for decades now we've been buying out most of these horrible dictators, especially in Egypt? Egypt received the second highest amount of aid. And so, and the neocons all supported that, because it gets to the other issue, is why is it so many people who are neocons, although most of the ones I've seen appear to be native-born Americans, promote foreign policy that serves the interest of Israel over the interest of the United States? And the other question I had is...
Well, I think that's probably enough questions.
Oh, well, Lindbergh, by the way, is a Swedish name. If you think that there was any opinion in Israel that favored the uprisings in Egypt and the toppling of the Mubarak regime, I assure you, you are mistaken. It's the notion that there is an identity of view between neoconservatives and Likud is a conclusion that borders on something that I find very distasteful. The broader question of propping up dictators, well, you know what? Back in the day when Jeane Kirkpatrick was writing Dictatorships and Double Standards, which is a sort of seminal neoconservative argument from commentary, her argument was that if you acted rapidly to undermine authoritarian rulers who might in time liberalize their governments and enable democracy to take root, that if you undermined them, the alternative was not a sudden onrush of democracy in a country, but rather the likelihood that less attractive, less savory, more repressive elements, and specifically communists, would take over the place. So, what do we conclude from this? One, that I think that it's pretty clear that an interest in liberty was the essential question and the essential premise throughout this period. Second, that in the absence of a serious communist threat, there would be no particular reason to be supportive of thuggish dictators, but rather their opposition. And third, that nevertheless one must, I suppose, be wary of something other than communism as a possible worse outcome. Now, at the moment, it seems as if most of my neoconservative friends, I signed that letter, by the way, have reached the conclusion that that propping up dictators is not something we're going to be in. We should not be in the business of doing. But at the same time, I think, you know, if the result is going to be anarchy and chaos, then it would probably be a good idea to avoid that as well.
In the back there.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. For Mr. Thompson, looking back over the experience of the past 30 years in terms of America's role in the world, its conduct of foreign and military policy, how would you distinguish, either in philosophic or in practical terms, neoconservatives from neoliberals?
For me, that's a tough question. We have one foreign policy chapter in the book, which my co-author, Yaron Brook, wrote. He's the foreign policy expert. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to punt on the question of neoliberal foreign policy, which I don't feel in any way competent to speak about.
Okay, over there.
Hi, Matt Duss, Center for American Progress. Thanks to both of you for a really interesting discussion. I think right after this, I was planning on heading over to the Foreign Policy Initiative's event on the uprisings in the Arab world, that kind of getting to Mr. Lindbergh's point that neoconservatives are still very much around, still very much engaged in the debate. But I'm kind of curious to Mr. Thompson. I find a lot of what you said about the the roots of the neoconservative tendency to be interesting, but how much of the continued influence in Washington, in policy debates, do you think is explainable by, simple fundraising? I mean, it seems to me if part of your argument is that we need to go to war a lot, you're not going to have a lot of problem raising money for lots of new think tanks from people who make bombs.
I'm not sure that, though I'm a critic of neoconservatism, I'm not sure that my criticism would go so far as to suggest that they're on the take from arms manufacturers. What I would say, though, is that the neoconservatives have been extraordinarily successful, and this in part goes to Todd's opening remarks about the persistence of the neoconservatives, which he is absolutely right. I mean, they have persisted in playing a major role in American intellectual life and policy discussions now for several decades. And I've written an obituary, so how do we explain the continued persistence of the neoconservatives? It's a reasonable and a good question. The neoconservatives, in my view, are the dominant intellectual force in the conservative intellectual movement today. They have more of the best university appointments than any other faction, one might say, in the conservative intellectual movement. They control many of the major think tanks. They control many of the best magazines. And more importantly, and this sort of goes to, I think, your point, they control many of the largest conservative philanthropic foundations. So much, I mean, if you are a student at all of the conservative intellectual movement, there is a sense in which we all know this to be true, follow the money, and in following the money, you will see that their control, and Irving Kristol was actually very much, I think, to his credit, I mean, he was one of the first people to see that, he who controls the philanthropic foundations will also then control, to a certain degree, the intellectual movement. And so very early in the 70s and early 80s, Kristol played a major role in starting and in running many of these philanthropic foundations, and then in the distribution of monies. And it was at that point that I think you can see a real shift within the conservative intellectual movement, away from both the libertarian and the more traditionalist wings of the conservative movement toward neoconservatism. And so many of the best think tanks were started during this period with monies from these foundations that were now under the control of the neoconservatives.
Let's take a question in the row in front of that.
Trevor Burris from the Cato Institute. Two quick questions. You mentioned it just now, but the relationship between neoconservatism and conservatism, because it kind of sounds to me like neoconservatism is, in your interpretation, conservatism with a grandiose sense of self-importance, jingoism, and power, and maybe a Soviet menace. And then the second question is, how would you relate your interpretation of neoconservatism to Carl Schmitt and Spengler, or anyone of that sort of 1920s fascism era?
Well, there is a very real sense in which, at least within the broadest tent that we can possibly imagine of the conservative intellectual movement, there is a sense in which I think it is appropriate to say, as the Wall Street Journal did recently, and as others have over the course of the last several years, well, in fact, David Brooks said it, we're all neocons now. And the reason why I think there is some credibility to this, I mean, the reason why I think the neoconservatives dominate the conservative intellectual movement is in part for the reasons I've already suggested, namely their control of the philanthropic foundations, but more importantly because, it does seem to me that most, certainly many of the best intellectuals within the broader conservative intellectual movement are neoconservatives. I mean, I do think that, look, just to be autobiographical, if I could for a moment, as Todd was, I lived in that world for many years. I was never a Straussian nor a neocon, but I lived in that world. I was trained throughout my entire university career by Straussians and was entirely